Laufer's book, Mission Rejected. He spoke about it recently at this talk from Village Books in Bellingham, Washington. This is about an hour, 10 minutes.
We're very pleased to have Peter Laufer with us this evening. As many of you know, he's a Vietnam War resistor. He's a former NBC correspondent. He's written a number of books, including this one, Mission Rejected, which he'll be talking about this evening. Unlike Bill O'Reilly, who erroneously claimed that he had a Polk Award, Peter actually does. He also has an Edward R. Murrow Award for study that he did of Vietnam vets who were suffering post-traumatic stress disorder. We are very thrilled to have Peter here. Please help me welcome him, Peter Laufer.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Brooks. And what an honor and a delight it is to see you all and to see this packed store. And what a spectacular store, and what a great community you have, just aesthetically, let alone now, to start to learn the depths of the political community that you have. I come to you from Sonoma County in California, where we are extraordinarily chauvinistic and arrogant, and we think that we are the center of the world in terms of our awareness and activity and participation. And yeah. Who's back there saying a little louder? Yeah, is this okay now? Okay, great. I'm just mentioning what a pleasure it is to see all of you. And what an honor, and I think I'm starting to feel what a growing responsibility it is to share with you some of the stories that I encountered during the last year, the quest that I've been on to connect with soldiers who have decided either not to go to Iraq or have come back from the war in Iraq and decided that they are opposed to that war and will work against it, or will not go back to the theater, or will do both. It has been an inspirational journey for me, and I highlight in the book a half a dozen soldiers that I get to know well, and maybe a couple score that I introduce in an ancillary fashion because I think that their stories and their points of view are critical. One of the things that's been fascinating the last several days that I've been up in your neighborhood, I've been to Olympia and to Seattle, and now to here, talking on the radio, talking in bookstores, talking early this morning at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and the depth of support here. I'm wondering, and really it's probably past wondering, I'm wondering if there is a connection between the fact that we are seeing more soldiers come out publicly against the war in this neck of the woods and the support that exists in the community. Because one of the difficult questions I'm facing is how many soldiers are in the service now and are opposing the war. As I said, I've got a half a dozen I look at closely in the book and a couple score more that I see in an ancillary fashion. One of the motivations for writing the book was to collect these stories and see if there is some common denominator, maybe some critical mass building. Because as our colleague back in the back from the Peace and Justice Center noted, my history is that of an arrogant young man who does not in any way fit in. I forgot exactly what the wording of that psychiatrist was, but my reference point is initially in this milieu, as it is for many of you other graybeards out there, I think, initially the Vietnam War. And during the Vietnam War, we felt such a peace movement out there, so loud and so active. And now, are we starting to see that building? Is it absent? Many of the soldiers that I talked to said that they were puzzled by the quiet on the home front, and that they were puzzled by the quiet of their generation as they compared it historically. And I'm trying to think back and think about when it all started to get loud during Vietnam, because that was something that went on for 12 years, and of course we hope this doesn't go on for 12 years, so maybe the crescendo that's building is at the right point. I want to share a couple of the stories with you, introduce you to some of those that I had the pleasure and the honor to meet during this last year. And then I want to talk with you because I know that a lot of you have a lot to say and will bring out more stories that I have from my experiences. And there are a couple of housekeeping notes that I too have been asked to include because we have the privilege of having C-SPAN here taping the evening. And that is one, not to talk again until the boom mic gets to you, but also allow me to be a nasty editor and keep you to the point of the question because we have so many people here and I can do that pretty well and I'll try to be nice about it, but I have to confess that part of my history is that of a talk radio host. I say it quietly because it's such a repugnant medium and probably ought to be illegal. And but so I know how to treat the callers and I know how to hang up on you. And so if I do hang up on you when you call, please allow me to apologize in advance. But I love the interaction and such great interaction we had at the church this morning. I just have to say one other thing. I have to tell you a story because of what Chuck said about Bill O'Reilly. I have another book out right now coming out in paperback that deals with immigration from Mexico called Wetback Nation, as he mentioned, I think, and it calls for an open border. What great fodder for Bill O'Reilly. Here's a guy who's a journalist and has written a book calling for opening the border. And of course, O'Reilly has, if any of you have made the mistake of watching his show, he has called for closing the border and militarizing the border. And my publisher received a call from his office asking me to be on that show. What a dilemma, you know? How do you deal with that? Of course, the largest cable audience in the country, some 2 million people, believe it or not, watch that show every night. 2 million people plus his radio show. And so that's great to get the message out, obviously. Look at the banner. I don't know who brought this, but I'm so pleased to have this backdrop. I am part of the crusade that so many of us are on, trying to stop this war and trying to deal in a productive way with immigration. So how great to have that invitation on one hand. Not bad for selling books either, which that's part of the business. And so I spent about a week asking friends, should I do this? And the advice was complicated, and often it was, well, you shouldn't do it because you're going to just get beat up. So finally, my publisher prevailed on me to do it. And so here's the story based on what Chuck said. I sat in a studio in San Francisco. Bill O'Reilly's in New York. And the show is ongoing and it's live. And during the commercial break prior to my participation, I have an earpiece on. And the voice comes into my ear, Peter O'Reilly here. I said, okay. He said, here's what's going to happen. It's his show, that's fair, right? Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to make your point. And then I'm going to make fun of you. So at least the guy's transparent. And we had a pretty good time. I mean, I must say, and Bill, if you're watching this on C-SPAN, I mean, you're a nice guy, but your content is repugnant. Nonetheless, we had a good time. We had a good time, I think. So that said, and it's important to find some frivolity because these themes are so heavy. They weigh on us and in such a heavy manner. And so where's the optimism? I think the optimism is in these stories. And that these soldiers are, I look at them in such an extraordinarily important fight. They are on the front lines of a fight for the spirit, the direction, the soul of our nation. They're on the front lines of this fight, and they have a credibility that is unmatched, cannot be impugned because they've been there. And the more of them that who publicly come out in opposition to the war, and here's this guy from just a couple of days ago who was at the Veterans for Peace conference at the University of Washington in Seattle, and he came out after being a year AWOL, and he's going to face the Army, and we'll see what happens to him. The more of them that do this, the more it has to encourage those who are in the military and are gripped by the understandable, not just inertia, but the peer pressure and the potency of the monolith of the Army and the extraordinary power of the United States government. And so even if they are considering stopping their activities, they need a catalyst. They need some stimulation. They need to know that they're not going to be alone, especially because it is so quiet on the home front. Now, I met, as I say, just some extraordinary people on the road. And one of them is a fellow named Clifton Hicks. Clifton Hicks, and I can tell you the good news at the beginning here, so you don't have to wait for it. He finally got conscientious objector status. It's extraordinarily different and difficult now. Circumstances, obviously, without a draft, mean that one can't apply to be a conscientious objector unless one's in the Army, because there's no point in it. And once one is in the Army, in order to begin to make a case, you have to prove to others in the Army, your superiors, that you had some sort of epiphany while you were in the service that turned you into a conscientious objector. It seems, according to Pentagon statistics, which of course are suspect, about half of those who apply receive it. Now, Clifton got it, so it's great to know the good news at the end. He's a good storyteller, and his tough GI lexicon mixes freely with a sophisticated interpretation of his 10 months in Iraq. His speech is staccato as he recounts one of the first events that began to turn him against the war. He and I spoke near his base in Heidelberg, Germany. We were driving around one night in the Humvees in Baghdad. Nothing out of the ordinary, he begins. We got out there, and immediately this drunk guy got pissed off and threw something at the Humvee. I thought it was a hand grenade at first. I was just about to shoot this guy. It was a bottle, and it broke on the back of the Humvee. I was not going to shoot this guy for throwing a bottle. I was kind of shaken up from that. The patrol continued, and things got worse. We heard a lot of gunfire up ahead, and you could tell it wasn't just a couple AK-47s. It was some U.S. weapons firing back. We knew somebody was in a fight up there. We race ahead down the street, and there's an 82nd Airborne Infantry platoon, and they're all parked in their Humvees, about 4 Humvees packed with guys. There's a house with the lights on, and people are all around the place. There's a big fuss going on. We pull up and we say, what's going on? We heard some shooting here. And they're like, yeah, we got ambushed just now. They started clearing buildings to find out who was firing at them. They kicked in the first door, and there's a wedding party going on. What they do in Baghdad, this is Clifton now telling me the story, what they do in Baghdad when there's a wedding, they shoot into the air. These people were up on their roof, probably a little sauced up, happy there's a wedding, and I guess Grandpa is up on the roof shooting off his rifle, and at the same time, as this 82nd Patrol drives by and is engaged by insurgents from a field, Grandpa is up there shooting his AK-47. So they returned fire in both directions, and I think most of them returned fire on the wedding party. They returned fire on the wedding party, and they shot 3 people. 3 people at the wedding party. Because somebody was shooting into the air to celebrate. These guys wanted to kill him. Clifton watched, he told me, as soldiers searched the field for the insurgents and found nothing but some AK-47 shell casings. The insurgents were fine, not a scratch on them, he tells me. They made it just fine. The innocent people who were partying, just trying to celebrate a wedding, 3 of them had been shot. 1 man had been shot in the arm, a girl had been shot in the leg, and 1 younger girl, who was about 6, was dead, laying on the ground, dead. She was 6 years old, laying on the ground, face down, palms up, in a little flowery dress. She was stone dead. Mothers and women are all bawling and crying. The men are all standing in shock. We bandaged up the 1 guy. The 1 little girl was crying. She was maybe 10, shot in the leg. Everyone is sitting around saying, yeah, they fricking killed some little kid. Like, what the frick? That's pretty crummy. I'm cleaning up some of the words here for the benefit of our friends at C-SPAN. At any rate, now, so at this point, you could say, all right, this is maybe understandable. This is one of the tragedies of the proverbial fog of war. But listen now as Clifton continues the story. The 82nd called it up to their guys, and their command said, Charlie Mike, military parlance for continue the mission. Just keep going. They packed up and drove off, so we hopped in our Humvees, and we drove off too. And Clifton is telling me, it's his voice, and that was the end of it. They applied first aid to the people who had been shot. The girl who was dead, they just left her there on the floor. We drove off and continued the mission. Clifton looks shell-shocked in the Holiday Inn lobby in Heidelberg as he tells the story, distraught and puzzled and disturbed all at the same time. Continue the mission. I was like, what the frick is that all about? We're supposed to be here to rebuild this country, to help these people, and we just shot 3 people. We just killed somebody's daughter, and we drove off. That's never going to be reported in the news, he tells me. No one is ever going to know about it except people who were there. So this Clifton was describing the beginning of his realization that this was not for him. This was a guy who came from his grandfather, his father, his uncles, all military men. He had always dreamed of being in the military. This was not somebody who was coerced or who was taken advantage of by the No Child Left Behind Act. He wanted to be a tanker. This is what his goal was. And this was his first hit in Iraq. He then eventually applied for CO status, as I mentioned, and I asked him what he was going to do if he did not get it, because it was not a sure thing at that time. If I don't get it, I have other avenues of approach to get home. He tells me, I've told them I am not going back to Iraq. He exhibits calm about his circumstances. He's made up his mind. It's not that I won't go back, he says. It's that I can't go back. I just hate that place so much. The sad thing is that I hate those people. I hate the reason we're there. He's spitting the words out now. The whole place is just so foul. It's a cesspool of pure evil. The insurgents are evil, but we're evil too. The insurgent who's killing me, he's being used just as I am. They say these guys are mindless. Look at us. We joined up too. We're both volunteers fighting each other. Once we volunteer, we can't leave. We become conscripts. We're just pawns. We're being used. It's a war, says Clifton Hicks, fought for filthy rich bastards, too cowardly to do it themselves, who want more money. Indeed. And again, Clifton's words, who want more money, and it's fought by us, the masses of uneducated fools killing each other. An amazing man, and an amazing experience to be able to connect with somebody like this, and to be able to learn this kind of intimate, personal response, where it comes from. And that is, as I say, why for me this last year was so inspirational, and why I feel some hope that in this now million, and that's the number from the Pentagon, 1 million soldiers have cycled through Afghanistan and Iraq since 2002. And in that million, how many are having experiences such as Clifton Hicks and are being changed? And although we're going to get a lot of damaged people back, already we have, not only are we getting them back in the coffins that we're not supposed to see going through Dover, and not only are we getting them back into Walter Reed where they're suffering these ghastly injuries, but we're getting them back obviously damaged. The PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder rates acknowledged by the Veterans Administration and the Pentagon as being exponentially higher in this war than in wars previous. And these are soldiers who are coming back, and they're being cycled back to the theater, back to where what it is that caused their PTSD still exists, to do the same kinds of things that led to this. They're not seeking treatment, some of them, because they're in this so-called volunteer army, and they're worried about what it will do to their career if they seek treatment. They're concerned about their peers, feeling that they are cowardly if they acknowledge the kinds of problems that manifest themselves when one is suffering from PTSD. So if we've got 1 million cycling through, how many are having feelings, experiences, and are still not knowing what to do the way it hit Clifton Hicks? And that gives me some hope. And especially gives me some hope when the most recent poll of the American population in general that was conducted by CNN last week says that some 60% of Americans are opposed in some way or another to the war. That's an incredible number, 60%. What is the overlay into the military? Who knows? The Army now says, as of last week, that they're going to meet their quota for this year. They were worried they weren't going to meet their quota for new recruits. 80,000 is the number that they say they need, and they now say that they're going to meet that 80,000. So who are these new 80,000 who are deciding to join up at a time like this? And even if the Army is wrong, and only 10% of those are how many joined up, who are the 8,000 that are joining? It's a sobering time for those of us who think this is so obviously what the sign says, and yet the cannon fodder continues. And so we've got a lot of work to do. Now, let me just read to you what happened next to Clifton Hicks. In early November 2005, I received a celebratory email from Clifton. I just found out that my CO application has been approved, and I've been recommended for honorable discharge by the commanding general. The note starts out like a dry recitation of the facts with no emotion. So I'm good to go, I guess. And he adds, I'll be home soon. And then a line of understated reflection. It's been a really tough period in my life. And finally, a cry of relief. I nearly fell over like a sack of potatoes when they gave me the news. I could hardly contain myself. And what a beautiful thing. And of course, it's so important that he gets that honorable discharge, because if he gets an other than honorable discharge, loses his veterans benefits and loses the $1,200 in cash money that he has to pay in order to qualify for those veterans benefits. And one more note from Clifton then. I checked back in with him just before the book went to press. And I said, what's going on now? And Clifton Hicks celebrated the Army decision to relieve him of duty as a conscientious objector and headed home to visit family in South Carolina and Florida, the war still with him. Just today, he wrote to me in December 2005, I was walking in the woods with my dad, and my foot got tangled up in a thin vine. I yanked my foot free and immediately thought of how stupid I was to tug at something like that, which might be a tripwire. Then I remembered that people don't generally booby trap deer trails in South Carolina. So Clifton Hicks, an amazing guy and representative of the type of men and women that I think hold such hope for us. Again, going back to Vietnam and to that which a lot of us remember, and I have to research this. I mentioned it this morning too, and I need to know where it came from. But we had this mantra, remember, what if they gave a war and nobody came? And we certainly are facing that now. What if there were so many more Clifton Hicks? Let me take a sip of this tea and ask you if you would like to talk at all, you callers out there, and again remind you about the boom mic and about the potential for me to hang up on you or lead you directly to your question, okay? Is there anybody that has something they'd like to say? Yes, please. And let me start with this woman who just stood up in the way back in the white blouse. And wait, please, for the microphone to get to you, and then we'll come to the elegantly tie-dyed fellow in the front row.
I don't really have a question today. I just want to mention that this is the lady who made the wonderful sign behind you. Margie.
Well, terrific.
Margie
Thank you.
White.
It's great to have this sign, and it's really important to take advantage of the opportunity. We have somebody up here in the front row, please. It's great to take advantage of the opportunity. I'm so pleased that C-SPAN has decided to bring all of you to the television, and it's great to have the sign behind me. It makes me proud to be in your midst. And here up here, I see your name tag here.
First, he's the local here.
Yeah, okay.
Hey, Peter. I'd like to suggest the reason for there being a lack of awareness of a peace movement during this war and see what your response is to it. A couple things. The USA Patriot Act, which has eroded a lot of our constitutional rights, created free speech
I'm going
zones.
to move you on
Okay.
because we know a lot of us, and those who don't or from the television can research
And
it.
also the fact that the media are the ones who are benefiting from the war, the ones who own the consolidated media.
Okay, let me take those one at a time. Where is the peace movement? Well, one of the places it is right here, and let's not neglect realizing that it does exist, and maybe we're too impatient. The Patriot Act, and that's been suggested to me twice now here, and I'm thinking about that. Is the repressive nature of the Patriot Act so paranoia creating that it's repressing and suppressing people who wish to speak out? I would certainly hope not. I would hope that we're still making jokes on our telephones and talking directly to the NSA and saying, what do you think this means? Of course we're in a troubled time. We don't want 10 airplanes to blow up on their way from London to North America. Of course not. But that does not include being suppressed in the free speech that we're guaranteed, that we guarantee ourselves, and that's so important to us. The media, I don't buy it, and that's perhaps my prejudice. 12 years with NBC, I have been on that inside, and now as an independent journalist, I think we've got terrible problems with the consolidation, particularly of electronic media, and with the consolidation of ownership. But at the same time, we have explosive growth in what's our variation on the penny press from our revolutionary days with the internet. And although it may be some work, I'll bet all of you, just by the fact that you're in this room tonight, know that really the onus is on us as news consumers to go get it. And with a terminal, even if we don't have the money for one, we can go to the public library and use one and hope that the NSA isn't tracing what it is that we're looking for, and then find sources that have alternative points of view. Dar Jamal is going to be speaking in a couple of hours here in town. I'm sure that the hall where he is going to be packed. People know the quality of his independent reporting. We can find it. So sure, it's a drag, but I don't think that's the problem. I think that people know. In some ways, it's a reverse, as we indicated. And I'll do this one more time here. We did it this morning at the church. How many people here know that pictures are forbidden at Dover Air Force Base of the coffins coming back with the flags? Okay, now look at this room. Almost every hand is up. That suggests to me that some of this stuff backfires. And so maybe some of the repression that we're feeling is stimulating us and getting us going. Yeah, let's take one more here before I go back to the book.
Yes, I'm Jesse from Boston. I was just at the with the Veterans for Peace Convention in Seattle, and we went up to the Art Park for a barbecue this afternoon. And at the convention in Seattle, the national convention, I'm from Boston. And
I got to move you on because we have this time problem.
The question I have, and I was talking to some of these refusals in Canada today and here, and the question is, I remember during the Vietnam era that a four-year officer, was able to resign his commission if he didn't like the war and go home and not have to worry about jail time.
And I can take off on that point. And one of the things,
a listed soldier,
exactly,
what have you, goes to prison.
And that's an interesting point. One of the things we're seeing, and boy, if I'm hot up here, you guys must be hot, so I so appreciate your being here. One of the things that we're seeing, it seems, and there are some suggestions this is changing, but those who choose not to showcase themselves and just go away are not chased. They might be caught by accident because there's a warrant out for them and they get stopped for something else. But those who showcase themselves, like Lieutenant Watada here in Washington State, are facing much more severe penalties. So perhaps, and times are different, obviously, and rules are different. It's a different army, it's a different society. But perhaps this is an attempt that also will backfire. And the Bush administration and the Army is trying to make examples of these people, but in fact, it's helping to teach, maybe, guys like this guy that came out of hiding AWOL this week, it's teaching them that there's support out there. And so that is really important, and it's good. And I mentioned this morning also, and I want to say this again because I think it's so important. the work that we do, those of us who are against the war, as little as it is, can be extraordinarily important in changing people one at a time. And it's great to have the bully pulpit of being on a Bill O'Reilly show and talking to 2 million people, or having a bookstore like this that Chuck and Dee have, so that programs can go out to the community. It's a terrific honor, as I said, to be able to write a book and have it distributed around the country, but each step is important. And I showed off this morning this sticker that I got at Orca Books in Olympia from someone who was manning a table outside the bookstore, and it says, "Refuse illegal war. Thank you, Lieutenant Aaron Watada." Right. Nice little sticker. And outside on the street is the little red Hertz car that I got at the airport when I came up a few days ago, and there's one of these on the back. So it's such a nothing thing to do, right? But if we just think about these little things that we can do along the way, talking to somebody that looks as if they may have beliefs other than ours because of the sticker they have on their car. My neighbor in Sonoma County voted for Bush. He's been a Republican all his life. We sit and talk about it. I think that's critically important. I see all these hands up. Let me just go back to the book for a second and then come back to you guys. Thank you. Thank you. This plays to just what we're talking about. And this happened last year at the Veterans for Peace Conference in Dallas. Were any of you there? Okay, so perhaps you remember when Brandon Huey is in Canada. He's one of the deserters who is up in Canada waiting to see what the Canadian government is going to do about the request for refugee status. So far, it's been denied at the lower level. It's being appealed to the Canadian Supreme Court. Cases are being handled by a lawyer who came out of Wisconsin in the 70s, dodging the draft, became a Canadian citizen, a Canadian lawyer, is an immigration specialist, and is handling pro bono these cases, including Brandon Huey's. Brandon Huey's an interesting guy. He joined the Army in part for the promised signing bonus because his father out in East Texas, poverty-stricken, was struggling financially, and he thought this is something that he could do. He could bring this wad of cash to his family, and the Army reneged for one reason or another. He never saw the money. He went to Canada. While Brandon Huey waited for the Canadian government to decide his fate, his father, David Huey, walked up to a microphone in Texas in a hall full of Iraq War opponents gathered for the Veterans for Peace Conference. And again, that was last year in Dallas. "I'm the father of Private Brandon Huey," he told the audience, which broke into prolonged applause before he added, "who is at this time in Canada." With a slow drawl, he proceeded to tell his story. "I'm basically a card-carrying Republican." He paused and then said, "used to be," and there was applause and laughter from the audience. "My story basically began when my young son called me from Canada and told me that he didn't want to risk his life for Bush and Cheney's son." Huey interrupted the renewed applause to push on. "That caused me a great deal of concern. As a matter of fact, it caused great conflicts. Our first several conversations over the telephone were basically fights." Huey paused again to compose himself. "But I started reading. I did a lot of research, an incredible amount of research, and I actually found myself not being able to believe what I was seeing happen to this country. So I sent my son basically a manifesto that said, 'I support him.' It took a lot out of me." Another emotion-laden pause before he added, "As I guess you can tell, I'm not much of a speaker." And a yell came out of the audience, "You're doing all right," and the hall again filled with applause. So it's brought me to this point, basically. To make a long story short, Huey continued, "You know, I've read the Constitution of the United States. I've read a lot of books written by a man named James Madison, a lot of things by Thomas Jefferson. When I did that, it helped me figure out that all of this is totally wrong. I just thought I'd come up and introduce myself. I do support my son." And there was great applause. And I mean, I have been faced with that passage for the last year, and every time I read it, it just knocks me out. And it gives me such hope and such belief that what is going on is so wrong and so transparently wrong that we're going to prevail. It's just it's depressing that it continues even while we talk. So I know that there are a lot of you who wish to talk, and I saw you first. And remember, please, the boom microphone, and remember, please, me hurrying you on or shutting you up is only a reflection on what the psychiatrist saw in 1968. Yeah, same psychiatrist probably.
I'm Diane Foster from Bellingham, and I just wanted to say that I think each Republican administration, from Nixon to Reagan to Bush, has gotten better at suppressing opposition. And so 2 years ago, I gave up working some night shifts to fly to Washington, D.C. I couldn't afford the time or the money. I was in a women's march, 1.15 million women, the biggest march Washington has ever seen. It got zero publicity.
Well, stop there for a second,
zero.
then, and there are two things to say about that, I think. And I'm going to move along
But
from your
I think
point.
the movement has gone underground to other means. I get 200 emails a day. I do letters to the
Okay,
editor.
stop. Here comes me hanging up on you because your
Yeah.
points are good. And yes, and my wife, who's in the audience here and has been incredible support for this project, believes that also, that Move On and other organizations of that ilk are creating a different kind of a movement, and perhaps it's because we are all at a different time in our culture and in our personal lives. We're not as footloose and fancy-free as we were when we were 18 in 1968. But in terms of suppression, two things. Yes, there is no question that part of the reason we are in this pickle is because of the skill and cleverness of the Bush administration. We cannot forget, while we're seeing how evil, what criminals they are, how they've hijacked our government, we cannot forget how good they are at what they're doing. Even if two things are going on, and I talked to somebody about that this morning, they can be both good and completely clumsy at the same time. And what they're good at is doing something like miring us in Iraq so that it is really a confounding situation to try to figure out what do we do at this point to extricate ourselves, even if we all, 300 million of us, believe that we should be out of there. That's the one thing. So they are smart in their own twisted, perverse way, and they've got a lot of power right now. That can't be forgotten. In terms of the suppression of news, I don't know. The Veterans for Peace convention here, from my point of view, even if I try to remove my prejudices, seems like a really spectacular news story. An organization with 5,000 members, 500 of them, 10% of them here in town, and advocating counter policy to that of the United States government. And really, there's been some ink in the local papers, but so little. I don't think it's conspiracy as much as it is sloppiness and laziness and so much going on. That's my hope. And then I go back to the fact that we can get material for ourselves, and that's also part of the new world we have. Let me go to the fellow in the black shirt in the way back and wait for the boom mic to come back, please. And thank you all for your interactivity. It's heartening to hear the questions and your points of view.
As the level of atrocity has risen from throwing wounded soldiers in the Euphrates River to the rape and murder of an entire family and the extension of military atrocity, I think that the resistance has come alive, and it's directly related to the fact that those things have not been overlooked.
The resistance in this country.
Yes. And that is a source of inspiration for people to realize that Americans are not asleep at the wheel when these instances are brought to their attention.
Let me take off from that point, if I can, for a second and say, yes, perhaps that's true, and isn't it sad if it is true that it takes that for us to move, but maybe it also falls somewhat to your point that these kinds of stories have been getting dominant coverage, as they should be getting, in all forms of media. And I think that there's something else that needs to be said at the same time while we're talking about this, and for us to think about the 1 million soldiers who have cycled through those two theaters of war, and think about the percentage of them who have engaged in these kinds of dastardly acts. I think it's, I hope, and I think it's unlikely that there is anything other than a tiny percentage of the soldiers that we have who are stuck in this complicated position they're in, such as that which Clifton Hicks so well articulates, who would consider going in that direction. At the same time, one of the things I learned by talking to the Clifton Hicks of the world is a beginning of an understanding of how that move can be made in the intense environment in which they're working and living, from doing right to doing wrong. It's an extraordinarily complicated set of circumstances.
If there is not adequate punishment for those violations of the Geneva Convention and other international treaties against those offenders, you will continue to see an escalation of these atrocities.
And please, here's a fellow up here for the boom mic in the front. About halfway up there, somebody was holding his hand up. This woman and the blonde woman here. And yes, but the corollary to what you just said is up the chain of command, not just those who were the active participants. Up the chain of command. Yes, all the way up. All the way up to our deserter in chief. Right. Right. Yes, please.
Do you have statistics on how many military personnel have gone AWOL?
Yeah, it's a spectacular question. It's such an important question, and it's a question that can't be answered properly or accurately, just as the question cannot be answered how many soldiers are in the military right now who are opposed to the war. And I'm getting a little rummy from talking with so many wonderful audiences such as this one, and I don't remember if I mentioned when we first started talking that if there are some 60% of the general population, if 60% of the general population is opposed to this war in some form, wouldn't it be nice if we could get a similar poll of the active duty soldiers and find out, even with sloppy science, where 70, 80, 90, but whatever that number is, what is the equivalent number amongst soldiers? Now, to the point of your question, last week numbers came out of the Pentagon regarding AWOL, and the gross number, the aggregate number since 2000 that the Pentagon is using currently is 40,000. Now, first of all, with all respect, excuse me?
Since when?
2000, year 2000. So the aggregate number really shows it about in the same place as they've been talking along the way. 6 times 6 is 36, right? So it's 6,500 or so a year. And that doesn't differ a lot from pre-Iraq war levels according to the Pentagon. But let's just stop for a second and remember, as we grab onto a number that seems like it might feel hefty, how do we feel about numbers coming out of the Pentagon? How do we feel about numbers coming out of a Pentagon that had an office that was designed to promulgate mis- and disinformation? And then, when attention was brought on that, announced, oh, we're not doing that anymore. Okay, the office that is giving out mis- and disinformation is saying we're not doing that anymore? And it's difficult. Now, given that, let's say the number is right. Let's say 40,000 are AWOL and deserters and other manifestations of taking a walk since 2006. It's really important as we reflect, and again, it's so seductive in an environment like this to think, all right, we're on the march, there are so many of us, and of course, we hope there are, and I think there may be, but let's remember a number like 40,000, that doesn't mean 40,000 opposed to the war. That can mean plenty who got drunk or missed their girlfriends or just had it with getting up in the morning at 5:30. And so that's just all the more reason why it would be so nice to have a sense of what the percentage of soldiers in the military are who oppose the war. And that's what I feel that it's not inconsequential, because those I spoke with, so many of them talked about their friends, their colleagues who were failing drug tests, going AWOL, just trying to muddle through and do as little as they could because they're opposed to the war. And let me see who I'm, yes, right here, please. That was a great look on your face. And wait, please, for the boom mic, and don't be insulted if I shut you up.
No, thank you so much. May I just give a website of course, after everyone reads your book, for more information on the War Resisters Support Campaign in Canada and the resistors and the support that the War
Sure,
Resistors...
let me stop you so we don't fall into that and say that these things are so easy to get from Google. And if you write to, if you just punch in Resistors Canada, it pops right up, the War Resistors Support
I'd
Campaign.
like to give you this pin.
Thank
War
you.
Resistors, welcome here.
I will take it and add it to my collection. I got so many of them when I was at the Toronto office. So somebody hold on to it. Mark, pin it on your shirt because I have one, but thank you very much. Just wonderful work that is being done. Do remember that there are 40, 50, 60,000 Americans from the Vietnam era who ended up in Canada and became Canadians. And it is many of them who are working so hard up in Toronto largely, but over in BC, in Saskatchewan also, to help those who decide to desert to Canada deal with the system. Let me go back to the book for a second here because I want to share with you something I shared with those of you who were in the church this morning know Darrell Anderson, and bear with me while I talk about him for a moment again because you're going to hear about him, and he's extraordinarily important. And I want you to know about him because he is going to help, I'm quite sure, bring more attention to those who are opposed to the war and are in the military. Darrell Anderson joined the Army, as did so many, and we've heard their stories. He was broke. He wanted college money. He needed health insurance for his daughter. He saw no other way, couldn't find a job that made any sense. But he also said that he wanted to be a hero. He wanted to protect his country. And immediately after he got into Iraq, he saw the kinds of things, heard the kinds of things that turned him against the war. Fellow soldiers talking about beating prisoners to death, explaining how they hate Iraqis and hate Muslims. And he was at a checkpoint. So much of the damage that we have done to civilians, it seems, occurs at checkpoints where due to misinformation and confusion, cars are shot up and families are killed. And he had experiences like that at the checkpoints. And then he was engaged in a battle on the Baghdad streets where he almost shot and killed a kid who was running away from the violence. And he says that after that, what was so traumatic for him were his own emotions. I'm angry. My buddy is dying. I just want to kill, he says. He then went home for Christmas, convinced he would be sent back to the war. He knew he would not be able to live with himself if he returned to Iraq, armed with his firsthand knowledge of what was occurring there day after day. He decided he could not again participate, and his parents, already anti-war themselves, supported his decision. Canada seemed like the best option. After Christmas 2004, he drove from Kentucky to Toronto. I'll never regret coming to Canada, Darrell Anderson tells me. He says he feels as if he's finally found his calling, lecturing to whomever will listen about the evils of the Iraq War and hoping to bring it to an end. Now, I spoke with Darrell about a week ago. Darrell's married now. He married a Canadian woman, and that means that he can stay, which is pretty spectacular for him because Darrell was facing the same situation as all of the deserters are up there, having the refugee status request denied and appealing to the Supreme Court. And so Darrell told me that he's coming back. And that's why he's going to be in the news. He has a Purple Heart for injuries in battle, and he is going to, in September or October, he says, come back and turn himself in because he believes, as he says, that his fight is here. And here's a guy who nobody can question his bravery. No one can call this guy a coward. He has the Purple Heart. He has the injuries. He has had the duty in Iraq. And he said that he's going to come back because he wants to sit in the he wants to be court-martialed. He wants to sit in the courtroom in his dress uniform with his Purple Heart on and do everything he can to get that publicized on television, in the newspapers, on the radio, with the Bill O'Reillys, getting it out there to those who he thinks he can influence, both in the general population and in the military, to make those in the military who are considering not staying around realize that there is support, such as the support you're talking about that's in Canada. So he's got, speaking of support, full support from his wife, who's going to come and be with him, from his mother, both of them planning to do Cindy Sheehan-like vigils at the courthouse and then at the prison that he fully expects to go to. Extraordinary bravery, extraordinary courage. These people who are the ones who are saying no to Iraq, these soldiers are putting aside their freedom. They're putting aside, potentially, many of them, they're putting aside their futures. They're putting aside their veterans' benefits. They're taking extraordinary risks with their lives because they realize what they're doing has been not what they want to do in the future. I don't know what time it is, so I asked for somebody who's, oh good, we have a little bit of time. So let's go back to you all, please. And let's get the boom mic up here to the front. Thank you. And again, I apologize in advance if I shut you up. Okay?
Okay. My name's Tim McNiven, and there are more people than just uniformed military opposed to the Iraq war. The civilian Defense Department employees are against it also.
An extraordinarily important point.
Well, on July 6, 2005, 4 FBI agents came to my home here in Bellingham to confiscate my Department of Defense ID card. FBI Special Agent Lance Boyer.
Let me stop you there before we get too much detail, but the point is taken, and it's an extraordinarily important point. The point is that it's not just uniformed personnel who are opposed to the war and are susceptible to having career and other problems because of their support. It is also those who are working as civilians in the Defense Department and for the government. And yes, that is important. I'm going to just keep plowing on here and take this woman who is there raising her hand. Yes, thank you very much, and excuse me in advance. It's the nasty work that I have to do.
I serve on the National Steering Committee for United for Peace and Justice, which has 1,400 member groups nationally and internationally.
Right.
And I also have been on
the 800 number and the website listed in the book,
right,
and easily searchable at Google.
And I've also been on a national steering committee of counter-recruiters around the country for the last 3 years. I have had conversations and debates on radio shows and things with people that say that because of counter-recruiters, there may be another draft, or that the only way to really mobilize a peace movement is when we get a draft so that the middle class that aren't serving get upset.
Let's talk about those 2 points.
And I really take umbrage with that. I think that's wrong, because I think the thing that really turned things around in the...
Wait a minute, let me stop you, and let's talk about those 2 points, because they're really valid and they're important. First of all, it seems so unlikely that there's going to be a draft, especially if they are, in fact, meeting their quotas, in part because, as was discussed earlier, they don't want guys who are the type that the psychiatrist says this fellow can't deal with authority. They don't want that. They don't want that in the ranks. That's the one thing. The second thing is regarding a draft. Sure, this can be argued both ways. But it is interesting to listen to what Congressman Rangel has to say when he seemingly promotes a draft, to suggest that if we don't have the entire country susceptible to losing their sons and daughters, then maybe we aren't going to be able to muster, as we've been talking about here today, as fast and as much of a critical mass as we did during Vietnam against the war, because one of those skills of the Bush administration has been to so cleverly and skillfully minimize the effect of this war on the home front. And that is a problem, I am convinced. That is one of the reasons why we're having a difficult time. I'm going to say thank you, and I'm going to move over to this fellow who's right close to you in the T-shirt and the baseball cap and say hello.
Would you spend a moment and address the lack of resistance and lack of opposition by our representatives in Washington and our state representatives to this whole event?
Yeah, what a critical question. What a critical question, and what a depressing question. As I said, I'm from Sonoma County. I don't know exactly the makeup here. I don't think it's probably quite as, it's not quite equal to what we have. Basically, it's very hard to disagree with any of our representatives on most issues. I find it hard because they just vote the way I would like them to vote. And yet here comes this war. And Lynn Woolsey, and I love you, Lynn, and I know you watch C-SPAN, and you're a great representative, and you've done wonderful work for the district. But she came out to our little town on the coast, and we had a very intimate meeting before the war started. There were only about a dozen of us in the Grange Hall. And we said, what are you doing? Exactly what you said. What are you doing to stop this? And she said, there's nothing we can do. Well, that's not why we sent her there. Now, since then, she's been doing some stuff, and there has been some movement, and we can look at the Ned Lamonts as taking care of some business, yeah. And we can hope that more people get Liebermaned. But it's a new verb, right? It has been appalling. And why? Are they afraid? Do we have a different dynamic? Because instead of the fraud of the Gulf of Tonkin, there was the reality of September 11th, and it's been so cleverly manipulated that that's created the kind of inertia, to be polite, that has resulted in there being such an unresponsive Congress and often an unresponsive press until relatively late. Maybe it just takes a long time to get these things like turning a supertanker, and now it's going to charge along. One would hope. I mean, it's the fact that this place is packed here tonight. That is a hopeful sign. That is a hopeful sign. This fellow is right down in the aisle on the right, with the short sleeve shirt. And again, excuse me if I interrupt you.
I'm short. You mentioned a couple of times the unimpeachability of experience, of being there. But I'd like you to talk a little bit more about the spin machine and its effects, and people who have been impeached in this regard. Max Cleland, John Kerry, now John Murtha, all get subjected to this. They were guys who've been there.
And you wanted to hear, yeah, excuse me, I mean, that's extraordinarily important, but what you asked of me is, I missed it?
How is it that their experience of war and now the response of this war gets impeached?
Yes, and I suppressed the applause that was coming, and the applause is appropriate to draw attention to how ghastly that is. Max Cleland being thrown out of office as a coward. Give me the proverbial break. It's just incomprehensible. And that's why it's so important not to sell the skill and cleverness of the administration short. It is so easy to say that George Bush looks like Alfred E. Newman, in part because he does. But I think that we really do ourselves a lot of damage by minimizing what good work they do. And they did the same thing, of course, to Kerry, no matter what one may feel about Kerry as being an ideal candidate, and to the others that you mentioned. Murtha now. Murtha, 37 years in the Marines? 37 years in the Marines, and we're going to say he's crazy? And perhaps part of that comes from the combination of their skill and a susceptible public. You know, and when I say susceptible, I don't mean that they're ignorant or naive or not as sophisticated or as educated as we think we are. I mean that all of us like to grab a hold of something that we feel has some permanence to it. And so if you've lived your life not being in opposition to the government, if you've lived your life embracing the government and the status quo and the stereotypical American dream, then perhaps it's easier to be propagandized. And maybe that's an answer. Maybe that's an answer. Yes, the fellow in the back there, please. And wait, please, for the microphone. And excuse me in advance if I shut you up.
My name is Shep Gerwitz. I'm a combat Vietnam veteran. I've just come up from Washington, the University of Washington, and I would like to ask you a question about a statistic that you stated. You suggest that 40 to 50 to 60% of the American public is opposed to the war. But
No, I'm citing the CNN poll of last week.
All right, well, the CNN poll stated that, and what is the efficacy of their statistical number if they're
So
invisible?
suspect, so incredibly suspect, except that it is not their, and this is important, it's not their self-selected poll when they say, call us up, vote yes, vote no. It was a poll that they commissioned to go out. But yes, a relatively small sample.
But I believe you're missing my question. I'm asking about the efficiency and the efficacy of that 70% not being visible. If we stood up and did a France-like protest to sacrifice a little bit of the money that we put in our pockets, maybe the government would get the message. So I'm asking you, what do you think about that?
What I think about it is that I don't know why it's going on, you know, and why the quiet exists. And I'm struggling with that, trying to get an understanding. It's one of the reasons that I wrote this. Obviously, we all do what it is that we do with the tools that we have and the access that we have. And one of the reasons I do something as inconsequential as sticking a sticker on a Hertz car, but I don't know why it is that we are, as a society right now, so publicly quiet. And again, maybe it is what we've heard, that it's going out, it's happening in a different way, and it's internet-based.
Please don't blow me up. This is just one comment. George Orwell said during the Spanish Civil War that we sleep comfortably in our beds at night while others do our killing for us. It's time that we stop letting them do our killing for us and raise the flag of
No
peace.
question.
Thank
No
you.
question. No question. No question. Can you bring the microphone up to this fellow here whose hand is up with the beard and the T-shirt? Thank you. Yes, yes, as we discussed.
What do you think about tax resistance as a form of slowing down the government
Well, you know,
processes
that
waging war?
brings up an interesting point, which I think is even larger than just tax resistance, that kind of a very personal decision, and that is how comfortable are we, and how much more comfortable are we perhaps than we were during Vietnam? Or another way of looking at it is, was it easier to give things up during the Vietnam time because we thought we could find something else to do, and now we're working so hard to maintain, and so we're loath to sacrifice, even to begin to sacrifice. Sure, there are all kinds of techniques like that that could do what the fellow in the back, the Vietnam combat veteran, was suggesting, that there needs to be some show of strength. And again, maybe we are impatient. Maybe this is the beginning of those kinds of shows of strength. Let me read something else from the book here to you as I look out and see if anybody is going to be severely troubled if I don't call on you right this second. And this is a woman, I mentioned her this morning, and she was a military policeman in Iraq, and she, I think that in many respects, her story helps us to begin to explain that which we're just now talking about. Why is there not more noise? Why are people perhaps conflicted? And that's why there's not more noise. Leading up to the March 2003 invasion of Iraq, anti-war protests were breaking out all over the world. And remember that. There were some phenomenal protests, and then maybe there was just a sense of exhaustion and a sense of frustration because it did no good, or seemed to do no good. And Kelly Doherty was sure war was not the answer, yet she found herself utterly compromised. I definitely would have been at the protests had I not been at the Army base training for war. Isn't that a compromised position? And she says it with a laugh that comes easily, especially when it accents what she sees as the absurdity of the Iraq War. It was a big conflict for me. I thought a lot of times, oh, I should resist. I should refuse to go. I should take a public stance. She laments the fact that many of those in the military who have taken a vocal and public position against the war are told that they are cowards. I would say, she says, it takes a lot more courage to refuse to go and to stand up against the status quo and all your fellow soldiers than it takes to just go along with it. But go along with it she did. Kelly had been in the National Guard for 7 years when her unit was shipped to the Middle East. Once there, the well-spoken former University of Colorado student, found compatriots just as reticent about the assignment as she was. My friends and I would discuss refusing. We would discuss the point at which we were going to refuse to follow orders because we felt that we were putting our lives in complete danger. But as much as we talked, we never did anything. When it came right down to it, you're either going to have to take a stand and suffer all these consequences, or you're going to have to suffer maybe the ultimate consequence, which is death. It was like death is uncertain. I know that if I refuse, I'm going to get court-martialed, so I guess I'll just choose possible death. That's Kelly. Kelly was against the occupation when she arrived in Iraq, and what she learned while she was on duty there only reinforced her opinion. We got over there, and no weapons of mass destruction, no terrorism except that which we created, she says. What were we doing? We were protecting ourselves. We were sent halfway around the world so we can protect ourselves. We could have protected ourselves much easier back in Colorado. She says others in her unit who initially were gung-ho about the war began to question their roles. At one point during her Iraq tour, and this again points to what may be the generation gap that was talked about during Vietnam does not seem to be here, which is such a blessing, and certainly wasn't in Kelly's case. At one point during her Iraq tour, Kelly's father was relatively nearby. He came to Baghdad as a peace activist, demonstrating against the war with the full support of his military police officer daughter. Incredible to think about being in that position. And so the fact that we have any of these soldiers coming out overtly against the war is remarkable. In the blue shirt there, another Veterans for Peace shirt. In the back, please wait for the microphone.
In fairness to Kelly, she was just at the Veterans for Peace convention in Seattle, and
right.
She is now a full-time activist with Iraq Veterans Against the War.
Oh, no, nothing in any way suggesting against Kelly. On the contrary, I am an extraordinary admirer of Kelly and the fact that she came back. And excuse me for not making this clear, maybe it's because I want you to all buy the book and read it, but she came back and was one of the founders of Iraq Veterans Against the War. And she is a remarkable spokeswoman. And
she's the co-chair
yeah, spectacular. And no, and thank you for making that clear. No, her story goes on in the book, and I hope and think I make it clear how I revere what she's done and the strength and her honesty. The way she talks in that passage, I think, is so important for her to point out what it was like to be in that position, and that she came back so politicized and has been doing such remarkable work since then. Thank you. Yeah, can we take the microphone back to this woman in the white shirt in the back, please?
Hi. Oh. I'm wondering what you recommend in terms of getting perspective in this whole thing, because I find myself getting mired in this war and these details and these very important stories from individual people, and yet how do you get perspective so that like a person can be effective against war is not a personal thing? And
oh, it's just so depressing. You know, today I can't remember if it was up at the Peace Arch or back at the church, but we got leafleted by a woman who had some information about farmers in Korea that were suffering because of the expansion of a U.S. base in South Korea, and I said to my wife, Joe, there's something else now. You know, the fatigue that sets in and really is hard to fight against, because there have to be laughs, and we have to have some relief, and yet the work is so hard because the machine is so extraordinarily pervasive. And I've said repeatedly on this book tour that my next book is going to be about flowers and butterflies. And let me wrap up, please, with a statement that I think helps answer that question, and preface it by saying that, in direct answer to what you're worried about, and we're all worried about, I think we have to pick some things, different things at different times, and just focus on them and accept the fact that there's a lot of other junk going on and we just can't get to all of it. And then we have to go out to a funny movie, and we have to have a couple of beers, and we have to shut down sometimes. Otherwise, we're going to be too exhausted to do any good. But clearly, this is a group that's doing a lot of good. And so let me leave you with this, which Specialist Jeremy Hinsman, formerly of the Army, who now is in Canada seeking refugee status and was one of the first, if not the first, to cross over. And it sums it up poetically and succinctly, I think. I was told in basic training that if I'm given an illegal or an immoral order, it is my duty to disobey it. I feel that invading and occupying Iraq is an illegal and immoral thing to do. So here's to Jeremy Hinsman and to all of these soldiers who are opposed to the war. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Peter Laufer has won the Polk Award and the Edward R. Murrow Award for Journalism. His new book is Mission Rejected. For more information, visit his website at peterlaufer.com.